Mikamu here with a post-editing note. Really quickly before the video begins, his video was scripted and recorded well before Microsoft's acquisition of Activision Blizzard. Just want to note this because the video talks about the gaming industry and the state of the gaming industry at the time of recording, which was back in December. Since we're talking about Nintendo and Nintendo Online expansion, this video is actually in the works since November, but work and other stuff's gotten in the way. So I'm uploading this about a month and a half later than I wanted to actually upload it. Um, we're going to be talking about the gaming industry, and obviously Microsoft's actions sort of changed the landscape. I do stand by what I said, especially with regards to what defines consumer and anti-consumer behaviors. Reason being that it's a little too early to tell what the Activision Blizzard purchase will have on the gaming landscape and on services like Game Pass. So, with that in mind, I'm fine keeping what I said in here as part of the video. Anyway, on to the video. Hey YouTube, Mikamu here. So almost every year around this time, winter, November, December, January, like clockwork, I make some variation of this video. This video being discussion about Nintendo, because every year, Nintendo fans and industry commentators are shocked at something the company does.
How many times do we have to teach you this lesson, old man?
And today I'm making this video in response to the Nintendo Online expansion quote-unquote debacle. I say debacle with quotes because obviously Nintendo can charge whatever it wants for its own services. It's not a scandal, but clearly low-quality emulation, high pricing, and a limited selection of games that is admittedly getting better, but still a limited selection of games, has resulted in one of the largest backlashes in recent history for the company. And even though the evidence is buried in the form of the missing dislike counter on their Nintendo Online expansion announcement video, I think the scar remains visible. So outside of a small handful of Nintendo diehards, I don't think anyone is defending Nintendo's online expansion release. And this issue of emulation and Nintendo's unwillingness to kind of share their library has had some people questioning if Nintendo has lost touch with its customers. I have some good news for people wondering that question. The good news is Nintendo has not lost touch with its customers. That's because, unfortunately, the bad news is it's never really had touch with its customers in the first place. Now, that's not to say that the big N doesn't make quality games, but the truth is that the company, for whatever reason, has adopted some of the most regressive behaviors in the industry when it comes to title availability, emulation, fan project tolerance, and more. In this video series, it's a three-parter, I'm going to go over examples to illustrate the true nature of Nintendo as an anti-consumer company and how exactly this came to be. The first video, this video, will be covering whether or not Nintendo is a monopoly, why this matters, and some ways that this manifests as anti-consumer impulses in the modern era of Nintendo's history. For those who are wondering, I have a narrow definition of anti-consumer here that just means arbitrarily reducing or restricting customer choice. We will go into that in a bit. Part 2 of this series will be historical examples of Nintendo's anti-consumer behavior to illustrate essentially that many of the things that modern consumers accuse Nintendo of have always been in the company's DNA, just from day one, at least going back to the 80s, as its current iteration as a gaming company. And then finally in part 3, which I'm debating if I want to do, but if this series gets good traction, maybe I will, look into the future and speculate about some of the trends that I think will force Nintendo to kind of adjust the way they've been responding to issues of this nature. We have a ton of ground to cover, so let's get started. So before we begin, let me tell you a bit about myself. I'm a lifelong Nintendo fan. The first video game system I ever owned was a Kiwi Game Boy Color. And, until 2020, I'd never owned a console not made by Nintendo. You can honestly just take a stroll through my YouTube channel and see of the 1,000 plus videos I've uploaded over the last 15 or so years. Maybe more than 90% of them are in relation to some Nintendo franchise, be it games on the GameCube, the Wii, the Wii U, or fan games and ROM hacks that are of Nintendo franchises and IPs. In terms of video games, I was mostly raised by Nintendo having some access to PC games. I didn't have a gaming rig or anything, just the family computer. It was decent enough for me to go to places like Sonic Fan Games HQ, So Far's Domain, Mario Fan Game Galaxy, to name a few places. Although Nintendo got me into gaming in the first place, given that the Game Boy was my first console, or first gaming device, I should say, I don't really think I became a gamer until I had access to these fan projects where fans were allowed to express their creativity and passion for their favorite franchises. And this is what exposed me to game design analysis. It also gave me exposure to franchises that were too old to have releases or that I otherwise wouldn't have been able to play because I only had current gen hardware. I didn't grow up with the SNES, I didn't grow up with an NES, and so I didn't really know much about gaming history, but for my experiences with these fan communities who were recreating these older games. So for a long time, I imagine that Nintendo saw these communities much in the same way that I did, um, which is more positively. I saw fan games and ROM hacks as ways for fans to explore game design possibilities for their favorite franchises while also expressing their love for these series. If they didn't, see fan games and ROM hacks in that way, well, I thought at the very least these communities were obscure enough that they would be left alone. But in 2016, for some reason that year, it was sort of like watching The Empire Strikes Back. Nintendo began aggressively going after fan projects. Pokemon Prism, AM2R, Jolt, the very first one, Prism, being a fan game that was near and dear to my heart. I talked about it back in 2016, winter of 2016. But 2016 was just the year where the big N went into overdrive, C&Ding all of these fan projects. I theorized back in that Pokemon Prism video that this was the result of the Internet 2.0, making these fan projects way more visible on social media, on YouTube, right? Way more visible than they would have been otherwise, in the days of when I was going to So Far's Domain on dial-up, right? There was just not as much information going around about what these projects were and how they're being developed. But honestly, it's still hard to this day to really understand, why the company did this. By this point, dozens of large, successful developers like Bethesda, Valve, Sega, they had all embraced modding and fan projects. None of these companies are perfect, of course, but assuming that, fans were working on not-for-profit works based off of their IPs or their games, many of these hobbyist works were treated with respect from these developers, and in turn, the hobbyists making these games, or these mods, I should say, they were treating the IPs with respect and care. In many cases, actually, you just have these fan projects, especially in the case of mods for games like Bethesda games, they make purchasing these games worth it well after the intended lifespan of these games have ended. For example, I bought Morrowind last Christmas because of the amazing modding scene for the game. And this is like a game that's, almost 2 decades old at this point. So I think that fan games, fan content, they can coexist with game developers because they simply can help one another. Additionally, as I pointed out in my Pokemon Prism video, fledgling developers who show a passion for IPs can easily become future developers. For example, it's now common knowledge that Sega had hired fans who worked on their own fan projects to make Sonic Mania, which in turn was one of the most well-received Sonic games in the last, few years. So, fan games are really helpful in building the future of gaming, and fan games and fan projects have also led to the creation of new IPs like Undertale, for example. So, many of the aspects that would go on to become Undertale were actually sketched out in a little-known ROM hack called Earthbound Halloween Edition. So imagine, for example, if Nintendo had C&D'd this ROM hack and had discouraged Toby Fox from working on it at all. With the way Nintendo acts today, it's entirely plausible to imagine a world in which this happens and we don't get Undertale because Nintendo had discouraged this creator from even beginning to work on sketching out the idea through a ROM hack. So I think this speaks to the importance of Nintendo's franchises for its fans. And more so than many developers, Nintendo has really cultivated multiple passionate fan bases in the form of grassroots esports scenes, right? Think of Smash Bros, which is probably like one of the most well-known grassroots esports scenes that had basically come up on its own without help from Nintendo, or in some cases, against Nintendo's own wishes, right? Splatoon is maybe not exactly in the same boat, but definitely not getting much more love and support from Nintendo in terms of that relationship between the community and Nintendo. YouTube communities are, another, source of Nintendo fandom that has not really received that tender love and care from Nintendo, right? With whole channels being erased into oblivion, especially back in the earlier days when Nintendo was more draconian about copyright strikes. Fan game makers and modders, which, they have a special place in my heart, obviously, given the content of my channel. And there's so many other examples of communities that have sprung out from the passion around Nintendo. For many companies, these types of communities would be an asset, right? They would be very valuable in terms of building their brand. But for Nintendo, these communities seem to come across to them, at least, as more of a distraction from their core area of focus. That is assuming that they just don't outright view these communities as a threat, which, given the way that they react to them, trying to shut down tournaments and stuff, shutting down YouTube channels, and how quick they are to take legal action against these communities, it almost seems like they do view them as a threat, right? You don't cease and desist something that you don't care about, right? But why is this, right? Why is it that other companies seem more tolerant of their communities than Nintendo does? Well, as Nintendo fans like myself, and I'm assuming you, if you're watching this, as you can understand, as passionate as we might be about Nintendo, the company itself doesn't really need to be supportive or collaborative with any of its communities to succeed. I think more so than any other console maker or game developer, Nintendo really lives and dies by the value of its IPs. And to that end, Nintendo has built a moat around its retro library and its characters and its franchises. And like a castle under siege, Nintendo attacks basically anybody, friend, foe, whoever, that approaches its gates. I want to talk about this analogy for a bit. Aside from invoking the image of Bowser trying to throw Mario into lava, the idea of a moat, at least metaphorically speaking, is a term that's widely used in investing circles. It was coined by Warren Buffett in the world of investing to describe companies that have developed a competitive advantage through a unique differentiation strategy that would help prevent the erosion of their market share or protect them from losing ground to other companies. Of course, all companies want to stand out in order to make the most money, but in markets where competition is high, companies end up competing exclusively on price. While competing on price is really good for customers, no company wants to compete on price alone because that's effectively, for them, a race to the bottom. So companies with moats develop other ways to have competitive advantages that allow them to distinguish themselves without having to stoop to the level of competing on price alone, at least. So many of the most valuable companies in the world, they're highly valued not because they have the best prices or the best products, but because their moats make them valuable. So moats can be created through any number of means, like branding, for example, or intellectual property. Sometimes moats can be created through inconveniences to customers, like high switching costs. Imagine, cancellation fees for a service that you use, for example, makes it much harder for you as a customer to want to switch, or at least it makes it psychologically, easier for you to kind of justify or put off switching to a new service. Some companies with moats happen to have good customer service as a defining feature of their brand. You could probably think of a few companies like this: Amazon with its insanely generous refund policies, Steam with its insanely low price PC games. But other companies simply wield their moats to protect their profits. Nothing more, nothing less. I believe Nintendo falls into the latter category. A lot of the issues that people express with the company, they really revolve around the way that it goes about maintaining its moat. So for the big N, its moat is really enforced by two major things, broadly speaking. The first is extremely aggressive IP enforcement. Hence all the cease and desist, the shutting down of tournaments, the list of things can go on and on. In part 2 of the series, we're going to cover all the historical examples that are relevant to really illustrating exactly to what extent Nintendo is willing to go to enforce its IP protection. And then the second part of Nintendo's moat is their consoles, obviously, which serve as a home base or platform or ecosystem to enforce console exclusivity. This console exclusivity doesn't just apply to non-Nintendo devices like PCs, but it extends to the availability of their older titles, their library as well, their retro library, which currently can't really be played anywhere except through limited time releases, or a controversial subscription service that we're going to obviously talk about in this series. Alternatively, Xbox has made its backlog more readily available via Game Pass. And if rumors are to be believed, Sony could possibly be doing the same depending on what their true ambitions are for Spartacus. It could be that, Spartacus is just PS Now and PlayStation Plus combined together, or, if it's a true revamping of Sony's offerings, it could be an ambitious Game Pass-like service that could expand to other platforms. But regardless, we're starting to see companies move away from the idea of consoles, at least in the traditional sense, being like the only way to sell games. And obviously, when we talk about the Nintendo of today, a Nintendo of today will not consider, for example, having a Game Pass-like service on PC to allow access to their libraries. So why does any of this matter? The fact that Nintendo has a moat is not in and of itself interesting, right? Because most companies today have moats. What is interesting, though, is when we compare Nintendo's behavior to its peers in the industry who additionally have their own moats to maintain, right? Are they any better or worse than Nintendo? That's not to say that Xbox and Sony have not experienced controversies, in attempting to enforce their moats. There are tons of things that we could point out. I'd be here all day. But when it comes to these specific issues around online service quality, backwards compatibility, esports support, recording and streaming rights, modding, emulation, Nintendo seems to more consistently make missteps, and in the most confusing of ways. And so Nintendo's handling these issues obviously doesn't necessarily make it worse than these companies, but it's one interesting point of contention, and it's obviously one of the key points of this series, right? We're going to be talking about these things, and how they stem from Nintendo's vision for enforcing its mode. The unfortunate thing is that these practices are likely not even necessary for Nintendo to have a competitive advantage. By engaging in these practices, Nintendo is essentially giving their fans a raw deal. Nintendo's customers could honestly be treated better, and the company could still maintain their market share because it has a long history of cultivating generations of gamers. Going back to the 80s, basically, Nintendo has built a ton of goodwill over the past decades, and it has one of the deepest and richest libraries in gaming. Were it to actually share its library more, not necessarily give it away for free, but if it were to monetize it in a clear, coherent strategy, and if it were willing to do everything to ensure that this library would be preserved, Nintendo could make a lot of money from that. But the baffling thing is, and I think most people commenting on the Nintendo Online expansion story have said as much, the baffling thing is, it's pretty obvious what kind of strategy would go further in entrenching Nintendo's brand and expanding the value of its IP, right? It's not limited time exclusive. It's not intimidating fan game makers, right? It's like there is a way to make money, and it's very clearly, making a better product, and Nintendo has, the goods to deliver. It just, for some reason, is not doing that. So before I continue my rambling, it's probably a good time now to define exactly what I mean by anti-consumer. So when I use the term here, especially in this video series, I'm really just defining the term to narrowly refer to behaviors that unnecessarily restrict consumer choice. Now, it's somewhat difficult to define what exactly constitutes unnecessarily and restriction, right? But I generally have 3 rules of thumb, or 3 heuristics that I personally use to decide when, I as a consumer am being mistreated, or if something is anti-consumer. So the first consideration that I take into account is if the action in question is neutral with regards to the status quo. Is this a new practice that enhances the existing features, that customers have already come to expect from a company, from a good or a service, or does it do the opposite? Now, Nintendo is far from the only company that has had this charge of anti-consumer leveled at it. This assessment can honestly apply to any number of companies. In fact, it was through evaluating how I felt about Epic Games' PC exclusives practice that led me to come up with these standards in the first place. Since I have another axe to grind, if I'm being honest, let's use the example of PC timed exclusives to walk you through my thought process in evaluating when a behavior is anti-consumer. So, in the world of PC gaming, exclusives are, a relatively new phenomenon that is exclusively, no pun intended, practiced by one company, Epic. So, this idea of exclusive games, however, is not new. Historically, console exclusivity is as old as the industry itself almost. And it was argued by companies like Nintendo, ironically, to be a necessary evil because console makers have dedicated proprietary hardware. And so the idea was that exclusives would allow more console owners to have a smoother experience because developers would be able to work with the hardware maker to tailor the game specifically to the hardware of their platform. Um, Now, it's kind of iffy if that was ever the case, but this is the reason why, for example, Nintendo prevented developers who published games on the NES from releasing their games elsewhere for 2 years. Developers essentially had to go all in on developing their games for the NES rather than, making a game that they would then port to the NES because maybe the port will be haphazard, right? If you're porting a game, there's more complexity there and standardizing the code than there would be if you're just developing a game for one console, right? And so it was argued in part that this was by design because, hey, if you're making a game and you're fully committed to the platform, you're going to learn the platform and you're going to make a good game because you're going to be aware of everything you need to do for this specific platform. And that was one of the arguments that Nintendo had embraced for advocating for console exclusivity. Of course, this created the precedent for consoles as a platform for, the last 40 years. And I think, it was a very sticky kind of practice, but it's becoming less and less the case nowadays, which is why companies like Sony are starting to move their games to PC. We have that with the release of God of War literally on Steam, right? And other trends like cloud gaming, gimmick or not, they're going to further erode this idea of console exclusivity because now games can be played on any device, not just devices specifically made for gaming. But in any case, games on the PC don't really benefit from this idea of exclusive stores, right? There's no dedicated hardware maker for PCs. Marketplaces are just entry points for PC gaming. And if a developer restricts access to what marketplaces their games show up in, well, developers are just limiting their access to the full base of PC users. So I'm not going to be coy here. We obviously all know why Epic has embraced this practice. Timed exclusive gives Epic a moat to compete against PC marketplaces like Steam, and it gives developers cash in a world where cash is getting harder to find. It's harder for games to stand out, and in some ways, I think development costs for indie developers has gone up. So I don't want to detract from how good this is for developers, but in this instance, we have a practice where the innovation Epic is providing consumers is not a new feature or service, it's rather restricting where a customer can access content. This doesn't seem to be for the sake of increasing synergies, as was the argument for the NES and for console exclusivity for the last 30 years. Games released through Epic Store, they're not tailor-made to use Epic's infrastructure, right, to improve the customer's experience. The customer experience for PC gaming is the same whether you buy a game through Epic or Steam, or even if you freaking pirate the game, right, in most cases. Not condoning that, but I'm just saying the idea of, having a tailored experience by working with a specific platform doesn't really hold water in the world of PC gaming. Now, going on to the second consideration that I use, when I'm evaluating these practices, is considering if other companies have different practices that are still friendly to the customer while maintaining market share. And so is it the case that everybody, in order to compete in this difficult world of PC gaming, has had to buy exclusive rights to compete with other large marketplaces like Steam? No, it's not. Most platforms that are selling PC games don't do this. Even publishers like CD Projekt Red, which would have a really strong incentive to really make their games exclusive to their own platform, GOG, even they don't do this, right? They still make sales through GOG and through other marketplaces, and they've not lost market share, right? So companies can still sell games through third-party services and compete. That's at least what we're seeing today. The third consideration that I take into account is whether or not the industry, in this case the video game industry, but whatever industry you're doing the analysis for, but whether or not the industry would be better off if everybody decided to adopt the practice in question. So going back to this idea of PC exclusives, would it be better if everybody, from Gabe Newell at Steam to the folks at GOG, would it be better if they said F it and they're like going all in on the exclusive wars? They're just buying out the rights to every single game that was ever created, in 2022 onwards, right? Will we be better off for that? I think even defenders of Epic's practice, of which there are surprisingly a lot of people, but I think even they would agree that the industry would be much worse off if companies partook in a rights bidding war, right? This would result in a race to the bottom where the company with the largest pocketbooks wins, not because they invested money into R&D to create better features, right? But because, they spent all their money to prevent their competitors from having anything to sell. So I guarantee you that if Steam were the one doing this practice of time exclusives to maintain their existing market share, there'd be a lot of people complaining. It would probably even be litigation and an antitrust lawsuit, right? But a feature of competition is that if one company adopts a strategy, then another is free to do so. That's why I think as consumers, it's important for us to encourage companies to compete in ways that don't make restrictions part of the status quo. Otherwise, we're implicitly agreeing to the normalization of these things. So in my mind, when a company meets just two of these criteria, it makes a company's practices look kind of suspect. I know it was a long detour from Nintendo, but going back to the big N, I think you could take a lot of the company's past actions or even its most recent actions and find that they meet at least two of these criteria. Now, I'm not going to go through the exercise of actually trying to map all the things that we've kind of had grievances with Nintendo with through my checklist, but just keep the checklist that I have in mind as we talk about Nintendo in this video series. I gave it to you as a guide to kind of understand where my discussion points are coming from, if that makes sense. So for the remainder of this video, I want to talk about how Nintendo's moat manifests today, mainly in the form of restricting access to older titles. And then in part 2, like I said, we'll talk about historical examples of Nintendo enforcing their moat, mainly through the IP angle. So today, whereas brands like Xbox have baked in backwards compatibility into their DNA, Nintendo seems to have to be strong-armed into doing it. And it does it in like the least efficient way possible. Hell, I mean, even Sony's inconsistent behavior around backwards compatibility over the past few years puts it light years ahead of where Nintendo is today. It's true that console exclusive IPs have been a thing forever, like since the dawn of time, but more and more companies are making even quote-unquote exclusive titles cross-platform after a certain period of time. Services like Game Pass allow companies to offer some of their library on mobile devices too. And there were even rumors that Microsoft was interested in having such a service available on, say, the Switch or other platforms that they don't control. Were Nintendo interested in competing with this directly, opening up a legal emulation service on mobile devices or PCs for older games would be a really smart move, if not allowing older Switch and Wii U titles to be ported to PC. I mean, heck, Sony could potentially be angling to do this again via Spartacus, if the rumors are true. Now, the fact that Nintendo hasn't done any of this is not inherently anti-consumer, but in light of the industry making moves that are at least appearing to go in this direction of more availability, more backwards compatibility, right? This makes Nintendo's limited time releases, as well as the drip feed content release for Nintendo Online, less acceptable by comparison. Nintendo has by far provided the most subpar experience for those interested in the preservation or enjoyment of retro titles, while its rivals seem to be on pace to make their backlogs more widely available. Why is the industry's oldest gaming company struggling to lead in this trend? They have the most content. They should be the ones who are the most eager to do this. Wouldn't it benefit them from expanding and widening how their retro titles can be accessed, given the insane demand for these titles, legally or otherwise? They would most benefit from expanding and widening how emulation is adopted by the video game industry. We can really only speculate, but I suspect that Nintendo is thoroughly entrenched in the home console market mindset. They want to eke out a domain where they have total control. We don't really know what the future will hold in terms of core gaming experiences. I'm not talking about things like Pokemon Go or AR experiences or the metaverse or whatever, right? I'm just talking about traditional gaming experiences where you sit on the couch and play in front of a TV, right? In this regard, Nintendo has demonstrated so far that they really have no interest in moving beyond consoles. Now, to be fair, the strategy has worked for them forever, and it's arguably one of the reasons why they were able to break into the video game industry even after the video game crash of the early 80s, because they had that control over where their games were being published, the quality of the games being released, right? And to some extent, I'm prone to believe in the argument, if only because I still have a place in my heart for Nintendo. But today, that kind of control is no longer really necessary. I mean, consoles are more similar to computers than they are different from one another, right? So developers more than have enough experience to adopt the different consoles because they're more similar than ever. Another thing that's worth noting, although companies like Sony and Microsoft have console exclusives that move millions of units, their franchises aren't really defined or influenced by the hardware that they live on. Nintendo, on the other hand, seems to really want their franchises to have a strong association with not just their platform and their brand, but to the specific hardware that the game launched on. To understand what I'm saying, just think of games like Mario Kart Wii or ARMS, which, while these games support playstyles other than the Wiimote or Joy-Con gyroscopes, motion controls are really heavily featured in the marketing for these games, and in many cases, the aesthetic of these games is really, at least in the minds of customers, really tightly associated with the consoles they launched on, the Switch, the Wii, etc., right? While Sony and Microsoft have original IPs, for example, they are not really tied to any specific hardware generation in quite the same way, right? And so, taking all this into account, Nintendo's strategy for doubling down on the current console market and really avoiding something like a serious commitment to a Netflix-style backlog service, be it on the Switch or some other console, is, as far as I could tell, defined by several considerations, which I'll go over right now. So, consideration 1, control. As I've been saying, control is first and foremost something Nintendo really cares about. The company's focus has been on moving units of its system, through bundle packages, which, is part of their DNA. They technically exploded into Western markets as a toy maker by pairing up Rob with the NES, right? And so they have a very strong preference for maintaining their own hardware, where they can craft unique experiences that really strongly define how gamers experience and play their games, right? And so these experiences, combined with the entry-level cost of Nintendo's consoles and having the oldest IPs in gaming, I think are the core combination that Nintendo has always considered to be the winning play for the company. And I think, obviously the strategy works, right? There's a reason why the Switch and the Wii were bestsellers, even among people who don't normally play games. And I just think that because this has been the winning strategy for Nintendo for so long, they're not going to deviate from this too much. Moving to PC, for example, would be a huge move away from this. It would dilute this market that they've created, and it would serve a different customer base. Nintendo games aren't technically demanding, as well as another thing to consider. They could probably be played on the vast majority of PCs built in the last 7 years or so, which most people have at this point. So by moving to PC, they move customers away from an environment that they have total control over. Today on the Switch, currently users have to pay to play games online, right? If they move to PC, if they offered a PC service, they don't really have that kind of rent-seeking power. I mean, I guess they could put in the work to build a more comparable service to Game Pass to justify charging more. I myself might be willing to shell out, if I'm being honest, $19 a month to have legal access to, say, 60% of Nintendo's backlog. But why put in the work to build something like that when people are currently willing to pay in droves to buy your console and then willing to pay again to have an even smaller library of games that you don't really have to pay much to maintain, right? It probably didn't take Nintendo a lot of time to launch the online expansion, but they're going to get a lot of money from it anyway. If only because it's the single place that you can legally play some of these classics on, regardless of the state of quality of the emulation or whatever reservations you may have. This brings me to my second point. Consideration 2, fear of competition. So going on PC subjects Nintendo to a lot of competition. Believe it or not, there are lots of good games out there, many of which are not made by Nintendo. I know, it's a crazy idea, right? I'm being serious here, though. Remember, I was a Nintendo lifer pretty much until I went to college, and some of these games have even captured Nintendo's craftsmanship more so than Nintendo has today. Consider, for example, that we haven't had a new Metroid game in decades until Dread came out last year, and while Dread has been praised as a return to form for the franchise, arguably newer franchises like Hollow Knight and Axiom Verge have taken up the mantle of moving the Metroidvania genre forward in Metroid's absence. It's true that Nintendo still has a commitment to making craftsman-like games, very well designed, very fundamentally sound games that are accessible to a wide audience, but because Nintendo's design ethos has been part of the video game industry for decades at this point, there's just lots of designers who've already begun to emulate that. And there are lots of titles that are arguably, in today's world, giving Nintendo a run for its money. And hell, even some of the fan games that are made, by Nintendo fans about Nintendo's own IPs are really good possibly, and this is why maybe Nintendo, threatens legal action. They're possibly good competitors to Nintendo's products too. AM2R is a really good example of a game that understands its source material, arguably better than an official product in the form of Samus Returns on the 3DS. Mark Brown of Game Maker's Toolkit actually makes a pretty good case for, how the differences in AM2R and Samus Returns partly comes from AM2R's understanding of the source material. You could check out that video if you want. But anyway, going back to the topic at hand, if there are two things that are true about Nintendo, it's these. One, they've never really liked for their first party titles to go on sale. In recent years, they've begun to kind of, ease up on that, right? They've begun to give discounts for games that are kind of showing their age, like Breath of the Wild occasionally. But when you realize that several of the Switch's top sellers are just Wii U games that are kind of spruced up and enhanced, it makes the lack of sales all the more insane. Just consider that Mario 8 Deluxe, the top seller of the Switch, is just a moderately enhanced version of a game released in 2014, right? It's very likely that if Nintendo were to move to PC, they wouldn't enjoy this kind of premium on their games, where PC marketplaces like Steam push the price of games, especially older games, fairly low, like insanely low. I just got back from buying dozens of games on the Steam Winter Sale, right? For pennies in a dollar almost. Nintendo obviously doesn't have to go to Steam to sell their games, right? They're not Sega. They could create their own launcher and people would willingly subscribe to that. But doing so still puts them closer into competition with platforms like Steam and Epic, at least more so than they are today right now, on the Switch, which is kept nice and cozy and stable by their moat, right? And if they were to leave this moat, they're going to face more competition. Nintendo is unironically the Bowser's castle of the gaming industry. They don't want a Mario storming their castle, forcing them to have to fight for, the consumer's attention. So, as Bowser, from within their moat, they could do whatever they want with pricing, right? They could re-release Wii U games, they could charge full price for them, bait you into paying subscription fees for DLC or poorly made emulators. But if they were to expand the PC, not necessarily leave the Switch entirely, but just expand, they're going to have to at least pretend to be interested in competing with these other platforms like Steam. And it would make their pricing schemes look silly for what they're offering, right? The second defining feature of Nintendo, going back to that statement I made, is that they're more of a brand, than other console makers. Having the history of single-handedly reviving the video game industry back in the 80s really helps them as part of their story. It's a core part of gaming as a whole, honestly, and Nintendo owns a huge chunk of that history via their library. But, in my mind, Nintendo's insistence on controlling their brand and their image, it goes beyond them just wanting to be a gaming company, which is something I talked about before with my friend E in other videos, but I'll elaborate on that later in the series. And one of the things that comes with this territory is the extent to which many of their modern games, as I said before, is defined by the hardware it's launched on. I already made this point with Mario Kart Wii, ARMS, right? You could think of other games that fit the bill too, like Star Fox Zero, whether you like that game or not. And this segues pretty nicely into my third point. Consideration 3, feature parity. So, point 3 is this idea of feature parity, parity being the degree to which Nintendo provides features that are expected in the gaming services of today. Nintendo has always been the black sheep of gaming, for better or for worse. They used cartridges, for example, instead of CD-ROMs in the N64 era. The GameCube had a proprietary CD format. Going forward, post-GameCube, Nintendo decided to forego competing directly on hardware alone to craft an experience that more widely appealed to more audiences in the form of the Wii and the Switch, right? Depending on who you ask, this move to motion controls is either an innovative way to make games more intuitive to non-gamers, and Nintendo is a genius for leveraging motion controls, or it's a crutch that Nintendo has used and relied on too long for multiple generations. Regardless of how you feel about motion controls, though, it's clear that these are a key part of Nintendo's strategy for differentiating itself. The strategy has worked, but it seems to have come at the expense of quality of life features for Nintendo's consoles and games, right? These are things like more stable online play, more powerful hardware, and native integrations for things like Twitch streaming on the Switch. Normally, stuff like this doesn't really matter, but over the last few generations, Nintendo has insisted on being more like other companies. In the Wii U era, it began adding DLC to its games, for example. By this point, of course, DLC had become so ubiquitous that no one really batted an eye. And it helps that Nintendo's DLC is as high quality as the core gaming experiences that it provides. I mean, look at Sora and Smash, right? And the dedication to his moveset being identical to his KH1 appearance, right? But still, this move to creating DLC for games puts them closer in line with other developers in the industry, which makes comparisons easier to make. In the Switch era, the decision that made them more like other developers and other gaming companies was the move to charge for online, which is something that they've never done before. But not only that, it seems to be a decision that was somewhat arbitrary. The Switch had online functionality before the online service launched. It was free, right? And so having consumers use Switch multiplayer for free for nearly a year and a half or so before charging for it looks kind of bad. Additionally, many of the Switch's most popular games are peer-to-peer, meaning that they don't really rely on dedicated servers, but instead on individual devices connecting to one another. So it's not really clear what customers are paying for, other than a service fee to unlock the functionality that Nintendo decided to lock away. In doing this, Nintendo again directly invites comparisons to other online services, which they come out woefully short. Now, admittedly, some of the issues involved here are factors that are outside of Nintendo's control, right? Common complaints like lag depend on a variety of factors, like the individual's internet connections, whether or not they're using Ethernet, right? But it also involves factors that are in Nintendo's control, and these are things like implementing rollback netcode into games, right? Building better hardware, investing in better online infrastructure, right? And on Nintendo's side, right, if you imagine a relationship with customers being kind of like a bargain, Nintendo's not holding up their end of the bargain. It seems like Nintendo is treating it as a given that they don't really have to do anything to make their services better or make consoles more appealing, right? Beyond simply making their games appealing, as if they were not in competition with other major industry players. That might have been somewhat true in the Wii era, right? But Nintendo's latest moves, especially their bizarre attempt at emulation, is now drawing comparisons to industry trendsetters like Game Pass. That's not to say that services like Game Pass are perfect, but comparatively, they appear to offer more than what Nintendo is doing. Or at the very least, there's a sense that Game Pass is getting progressively better, while Nintendo Online really isn't. So in terms of how feature parity matters for Nintendo if it were to actually move to other platforms like the PC, there's a secondary consideration in the issue of game quality. Now, I hear you groaning. This is going to be a point that is more contentious. I'm sure many people will want to fight me, but hear me out. So quality for older first-party franchises like Zelda and Mario tend to be fairly consistent. They may have games that have features that are not popular, but in terms of the polish of these games, they're relatively consistent across generations. But for franchises like Pokemon, it's becoming more and more apparent that Nintendo, or I guess Game Freak in this instance, has fallen behind the competition. Barring, I'm recording this before Legends Arceus, so don't murder me if that game is highly acclaimed. I'm excited for it too, but even there, you could argue that, hey, maybe some of these features, while they are novel for Pokemon, may not be novel to, say, the genre of RPGs. Anyway, I don't want to rehash my discussion of Sword and Shield, which I had with my friend E on the channel. You can watch that video if you want to. We go over a lot of the issues we see with Sword and Shield. But the fact that, for example, overworld encounters were celebrated as a awesome feature in 2019 in an RPG is laughable. Especially for a franchise as big as Pokemon, right? It's novel within the context of Pokemon, of course, but overworld encounters have existed in games for decades at this point, right? So the bar is comparatively lower for Pokemon for whatever reason. But if you envision a world in which Nintendo actually had an online service on PC where you could play their games like Sword and Shield, just pretend that Sword and Shield was side by side with other JRPGs and open world RPGs on PC that were being sold on sale, right? They were discounted for whatever reason. And then just remember that Nintendo likes keeping their games full price pretty much indefinitely, maybe with some small discounts here and there, but pretty much you're paying full price for Sword and Shield. I don't think there's a reality in which Nintendo would be happy with this, right? This is a world that Nintendo doesn't want to live in because it would make them look kind of bad. But on their own console, where the only people who are there are people who are dedicated and who love their franchises, they could charge whatever the hell they want for their titles. They don't have to compete on features. They don't have to compete on price. They own the domain, right? They could do whatever they want. And that's the whole point of having your own system, your own console. And so I think this in and of itself is one of the strongest incentives against, say, a Netflix-style retro service that's on the PC or mobile devices, right? And so moving on to the final point, consideration 4, mods. Mods are the bane of Nintendo's existence. Nintendo's been kind of made into a laughingstock when you compare fans' efforts to the company itself, right? Fan emulators have existed for decades at this point, and they are leagues better than whatever the hell Switch Online is, right? When you look at some fan games, like I mentioned AM2R, but you could probably pull up another example if you want. Some of these games have been extremely well received, almost as well received as, as actual Nintendo games, right? And so I don't think this is something that they want to be exposed to. As I said before, they have a strong experience to control how their brands are perceived and how the experience of players is cultivated, and modding completely disrupts that. Additionally, mods might show up for games that are controversial, like Sword and Shield, and they might actually really change the narrative around what Nintendo should be doing with their franchises. And that could be, again, something of concern for the company. Could you imagine a world in which, say, Samus Returns was ported or emulated legally to a PC, and then the dev of AM2R, instead of building the game from scratch, was able to use the engine of Samus Returns to make a remake of far better quality? I just can't see a world in which Nintendo would happily allow their content to be readily available on PC. And PC is really all about modding, right? I think that this probably is another point of concern for Nintendo in evaluating whether or not to bring their experiences to other platforms. Now, why am I talking about this idea of not wanting to go to PC and not offering, or expanding where Nintendo content is available? It's pretty simple. It's just to illustrate that Nintendo is a company that has avoided doing what the industry has done. Sometimes this is great, right? Nintendo stood up to practices like microtransactions and DLC for a long while, right? And that's good. But other times, like now, it leads to consumers having less choice. Nintendo is perfectly happy to enforce a surcharge for simply browsing poorly emulated ROMs on their online service that offers less features than something from 2004. I'm talking about both the emulators lacking features from 2004. There were better emulators back then. And I'm talking about the online service, right? In 2004, there were way better emulators for N64. For whatever reason, Nintendo just either doesn't know about them or doesn't care. And the online service itself, well, Xbox, Live back in 2004 had voice chat, right? So arguably, the experience of Xbox Live circa 2004 is better than Nintendo Online today. But part of the reason why they can get away with this is because when you view their offerings in the vacuum of their own moat, which they want you to do, all this seems relatively acceptable. But when you compare Nintendo's practices to their peers, or when you compare the company's level of technical polish around certain projects like emulators to the work of fans who've created things like the Mario 64 PC port, Nintendo falls woefully short. But again, that's the point of having a moat. Nintendo doesn't have to compete on features or price. It just has to sell you on the idea that it's acceptable in 2022 to make you pay for emulators that are worse than the ones released 20 years ago. Or that it's acceptable to pay every single time a new generation rolls around to have access to the same handful of retro titles on your new console, right? As if companies like Sega have not already found a way to make their classic library legally available for very cheap across multiple platforms. So companies like Valve and yes, even Sega are good examples of modern gaming companies who realized that they were in competition with piracy. What did they do? They opened up their ecosystems, they priced their games aggressively low, and for some of their titles, you can get them for very cheap, especially during holiday seasonal sales. They also respect fan projects, and in the case of Valve, they even let quality mods go on sale on their platform, on their storefront. Now, I'm not saying Nintendo has to do all these things. They don't have to go to this extreme to be considered a consumer-friendly company. But given the central role it's played as the bastion of video games and holding, a lot of video game history, its stingy Scrooge-like approach in hoarding its retro library and overcharging for emulation is disappointing to say the least, especially when the industry as a whole seems to be moving, at least at some level, towards this idea of platform agnostic emulation. I know it's ultimately a huge question mark if this is actually going to happen, right? Is Spartacus is actually going to be backwards compatible in any meaningful way, if Game Pass will actually expand emulation. But we've not even seen Nintendo discuss the possibility of these ideas at all, right? Anyway, fingers crossed that my analysis is completely off here and that this video ages like rotten milk. I would love for that to happen. I would love for Nintendo to just show me that I was completely wrong and that they're going to do at least a fraction of the things that I have kind of talked about in this video. But at present, it's not really shown itself to be that kind of company, right? It's definitely the company that digs into its moat. Like Bowser, it throws stuff at you while it tries to avoid jumping attacks. With that said, join me in part 2 of this series where we're going to look at Nintendo's history to highlight how this behavior is pretty much consistent with the way the company has always carried itself, and why this gives me less hope for the near future, at least, in terms of accessing retro titles and having a more consumer-friendly version of Nintendo. With that said, take care, everyone. I'll talk to you next time.